Thank you, and hello everyone, and many thanks to Peter and Jean-Marie for bringing us together. As a proud European who's been so dismayed at some of the narratives around Europe, it's wonderful that meetings such as this, the UK rejoining Horizon, can be part of bringing the continent together. Thank you very much, and I understand how to go on. So let me start with what I think is probably the most extraordinary thing that's happened in my adult intellectual lifespan, and that is the demographic transition. Even 30 or 40 years ago, it was hard to be positive about human populations going ahead. But now we know that if we bring people out of poverty, a good thing. If we educate children, especially girls, a good thing. If we provide access to reproductive health care, and if we educate, as I said, educate children, especially girls, then human fertility decreases. And we've probably already gone through peak children, and we will shortly get to the time where the number of daughters that survive to reproductive age for an average woman in the world is going to be around 1. So I think we can now talk about a time when the imprint on humanity, the demands that humanity places on the world to produce food, which I'm going to talk about today, but other resources, will no longer continue to increase. So with all the difficulties, and we've talked a lot about climate change, and I'll talk about climate change in a moment, with all these difficulties, I like to say that I'm more positive now at my extreme old age than I was when I was a student, however many years ago. Now, of course, one of the things about people coming out of poverty is that they demand a more varied diet, and a diet that requires more resources to produce. And an example of that is they require more meat. And here I've plotted, this is some data from Our World in Data from Oxford, of the meat consumption per person as a function of GDP for different countries. And as countries get richer, then more meat is demanded. So it's not quite as simple as population, but a variety of estimates of how much food, the maximum greater demand compared with now of food from the global population. They range, including some from Oxford, they range from about 30 to 60%. So it's definitely doable. So that's the good news bit, but of course we have climate change, and climate change is already severely affecting food production. These are examples from largely from the developed world, but that's an example from cattle in Africa on the lower right. And again, as a number of speakers have already said, we're beginning to see the effects of climate change. On the left is warming in the UK over the last 30 years, and on the right is some projections for what's likely to happen in France with different scenarios going into the future. So we are being faced with tangible and important climate change that is increasingly impossible to avoid or deny. This is a sort of thought experiment work that Mike Clark and a group of people at Oxford did. And this is looking at the cumulative amount of emissions this century and what that will do with the likelihood of us exceeding 1.5 or 2%. So there are a couple of thresholds there. The bottom is there'll be a third of a possibility we'll go through 1.5. The top is there is a 50% possibility that will go through 2 degrees. And the thought experiment is this, that if you take the food system as it exists at the moment, and you assume it goes on into the future with relatively little change, just business as usual, you have an economic model which takes a sort of projection of what's going to happen with income, and then we'll sort of work that through to look at diets and things, then the food system alone is going to get us almost certainly through 1.5 and is pushing up towards 2 degrees. And I say this is a thought experiment. This assumes that we've cured all the other different aspects of society that Julia talked about earlier on. The food system alone could push us over some of these barriers. And so what that says to me is that maintaining our current food system going ahead is just not an option if we really care about net zero, if we care about trying to reduce global warming. And again, Julia's graph showed that, certainly with the UK and similar elsewhere, that while there has been progress in other sectors, progress in agriculture and land use has been much, much less. And it has been in the too difficult box for a long time. It's not been part of the COP process until quite recently. And so we're really going to have to think about food going ahead. So where in the food do most emissions come from? This is some work done by Marco Springman, and the single biggest component of the food system that produces greenhouse gas emission is livestock, and that's livestock producing meat and dairy. So again, this is a really difficult message to give to policymakers, to give to government, that we have to talk about reducing our consumption of animal source foods. And again, in Julia's talk, she talked about how much of the progress has so far been on using technological interventions, things that don't affect the way we behave. But if we begin to talk about making changes in this, there are some technological things we can do. I'll talk about them very briefly. But a lot of it is going to affect the way we actually behave. And that's difficult for us. It's difficult for policymakers. This is just something in parentheses here, that livestock is, and again, I just forget which I think it was in Andy's talk, yes. So Andy put up a graph of methane, and 46% of methane is produced by livestock. And the dynamics of methane in the atmosphere is a little bit different from carbon dioxide. And you can argue, and my colleague at Oxford, Miles Allen, has argued this very forcefully, that some of the metrics that we use at the moment for carbon dioxide don't work perfectly for methane. And I think he is right there. And this has been taken up by some in the livestock industry as a get-out-of-jail card, as a reason that one doesn't have to take difficult decisions in that sector. And I think that's wrong for a number of reasons, some such as Andy talked about, the effects of methane as precursors to ozone, etc. But also reducing methane is one of the few things that we can do in the short term that actually causes cooling rather than just prevents further warming. So I'm happy to talk more about that, but I just wanted to put that in parentheses. So I'm going to largely concentrate on what we can do. And if you think of what one can do in this area, you can divide up the sort of potential interventions into different ways. I tend to divide it up into 4 ways, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them. One is demand-side interventions, which I'll talk about first. Then I'll go on to talk about some things at the supply side. And finally, I'm going to talk about one aspect of governance. And the one thing I won't talk about is waste. We do need to reduce waste. But again, it's not a get-out-of-jail card. And Liz pointed out that in her talk earlier on, that completely removing waste, it's an example of what she said, you don't want to do something absolutely. The marginal benefits of reducing waste towards the end can be pretty low. So waste is something we should really think about, but we should also be realistic about just how much we can do there. So demand-side interventions, well, again, you can classify them in different ways. I've classified them in terms of, first, educate and inform, behavioral interventions, nudges and things. These are the things that they're relatively popular with policymakers because they don't lead to difficult headlines in the newspapers and things. Often you'll hear policymakers say, well, we need to do educate, inform, behavioural interventions, and we need much more research into what works. So I'm an academic, of course, I'm contractually obliged to say we much need more research, but I'd also say we actually have a very good evidence base at the moment about what aspects work and don't work. It could be better, but we do know. And I would argue that educate, inform, nudges, etc., they do make a difference. But they don't make a difference at the scale that we need if we're going to transform the food system. Again, just referring to work from my colleague Susan Jebb at Oxford, She runs a wonderful thing, a virtual supermarket, so you can do experiments on different labeling and get people to sit in front of a screen. And she's been exploring with colleagues a variety of different eco-labels. And you find, at least in the virtual supermarket, that it does make a difference. Not a huge amount of difference, but a difference at the margin. But when you take the same type of interventions and you try them in the field, in a real food, in this case, with a national caterer, so in a real canteen, the effects virtually disappear. So again, there's nothing wrong with better education, better labels, doing nudges where you can, putting the less greenhouse gas emission options towards the front in a restaurant. But just don't pretend that this is going to make the difference at scale. And this then leads on to some of the harder things that you might do, some of the things that revolve around fiscal intervention, some of the things that revolve around regulation. And again, there is some really good evidence that these will work. And let me give you an example from the UK. So a little over 10 years ago, the then government, the Cameron-Osborne government, brought in an industry levy on the sweetest type of sugary soda beverages, so the type of fizzy drinks that are really, really full of sugar. And a number of us at the time, both economists and other people, thought that this actually wasn't the right thing to do. It was an industry levy. It affected what industry did. It didn't have a direct effect on the consumer. And we thought there's a bit of economics 101 there. You needed something that would affect prices and affect consumer behavior. It's one of those cases where it's really nice to be proved wrong. It was announced in 2016. It was introduced 2 years later. During that period, the industry reformulated its products in such a way that the most sugary sodas, the amount that they were being sold reduced significantly. And my colleague at Oxford, Pete Scarborough, has done some analysis on this. He found, interestingly, it had no impact on company profitability. It had little effect on consumer behavior. They still continued to purchase a particular brand, even though it was less sugary. And it had, and again, there is more uncertainty when you begin to model and you have to make assumptions about the relationship with disease. But he found both positive effects on health outcomes and, interestingly, on health inequality. One of the criticisms is that interventions like this particularly affect the poorest decile in society, but he found that the health benefits were highest in those poorer parts of the society. And here is something that is more of a thought experiment, and that reflects back on some of the things that Andy talked about a little while ago. So it's a thought experiment because we do an analysis that is not realistic, but I think it's useful or interesting because it sort of delimitates a little bit the policy space in which one might work. So this was, let's assume we have an idealized food carbon tax. And let's impose it in middle and high-income countries. So we're not doing the ridiculous thing where we expect low-income countries to change their diets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And when you do that, you put a change in price, that's the blue histograms going up, on beef oils, milk, don't worry about the details, but going back. And then the response, which is determined by the different price elasticities that have been observed, is the red histograms going down. And when you do this and you put it through a partial equilibrium model, then what you get at the end is you get 1 gigaton less of emissions per year, which is roughly about 10% of what we would need to do to keep the climate within 2 degrees. So a significant wedge along the way. And then most interestingly, there is 500,000 fewer diet-related deaths a year. And again, this is a point that Andy made. There are some really interesting co-benefits about changing diets and for health and for environment. And again, well, rather hopefully I say this is interesting, but I do realize that this is an academic study. We're not going to have a tax imposed everywhere throughout the world. But it does, I think, show that fiscal measures are one thing that one could do if one had the bravery to do it. One thing that I think is going to make a major difference is the action of the private sector. So many companies, I've picked up Nestle here, but I could have picked up many other different companies, have made commitments for net zero for 2040, 2050 in those timeframes. And they do things quite quickly on Scope 1 and Scope 2. And then for many in the food sector, it's largely Scope 3. Scope 3 is the big component. And you look at the Scope 3 and you wonder, how on earth are you going to reduce your Scope 3s? And reducing animal source food is one of the few things they can do relatively fast. And I think we're going to see a substitution of meat and dairy products for a whole variety of different alternative proteins that is attracting large investment at the moment. And if I was to predict, I would say that within 10 years, the majority of meat in these processed type of components, the majority of meat and dairy components, will come from alternative sources. And this will have, I'll mention in a moment, a variety of different effects on the complexity of the food system and food markets. So that's demand-side interventions, and then there is a lot we can do on the supply side. Again, you have some people who will argue, look, we have to do diet change, and to concentrate on, say, methane inhibitors in cattle. Well, that takes the focus off the importance of diet change. I think the challenges are of sufficient magnitude and of sufficient severity that is both daunting, but it sort of makes it quite simple. And it makes it simple in the sense that we have to do something on action on all fronts. We have to do something on demand, we have to do something on supply, similarly waste and governance. So I don't think that there is a sort of moral hazard in saying one must do more on reducing reducing emissions from cattle. That's not a way of avoiding hard questions about diet change. We just have to do all things together. And there are a host of exciting different projects and different initiatives that could help reduce the emissions from the livestock that we do. I'm concentrating on livestock here. I could give examples from other food sectors as well. And I'm not going to read through them, but this is one of the things I'm very pleased that parts of the Horizon programme, part of the farm to fork strategy of the European community are putting a major component on that. And there are some really interesting things about what can be done with carbon removal in farmland and on the broader land use sector. I mean, at the moment, it is true that essentially the only proven technology that we have for getting carbon out of the atmosphere at scale is through carbon sequestration in the soil and tree planting. And Julia made this point in her presentation early. We need to make certain that we encourage that more is done on this. And in addition, there are a variety of other things that one can do simultaneously with food production, such as incorporating charcoal biochar in the soil, enhanced rock weathering. What that machine is doing is spreading powdered basalt rock onto farmland, and that will capture CO2 dissolved in rainwater coming down. And then there's an enhanced peatland restoration and bioenergy BECCS. So I'm encouraged about this, but there are also some major issues here as well. Carbon sequestration in soils is great, but we have to be realistic. There are limits to what can be soiled, what can be stored, and soil carbon reaches an asymptote relatively fast. There is the issue of carbon persistence. If we then go on, if there's a forest fire or we plough a soil, then we'll lose that carbon. There is carbon leakage. If we do good things on our farmland in Europe, and these are replaced by imports from polities which have less strict rules and more carbon dioxide may go in the air, may go out in the air. And then something which really upsets me at the moment is that we have a really immature market structure here. We have a need for more experimentation, but simultaneously, as we're working out whether, for example, biochar enhanced rock weathering works, then we have companies offering carbon offsets, which other companies can buy. And it's essentially the Wild West out there, and there seems to be a reluctance to try and regulate this market. And whereas we have no worries about having our stock markets or our commodities markets heavily regulated, we want them to be regulated. That regulation is a public good. It ensures them to be efficient. But we're unwilling to regulate these other carbon markets, and that is causing some real harm. Right, I'm running out of time, and so I just want to finish on 2 points. First of all, everything we need to do must be within the context of a better narrative. And again, the Gilets jaunes, what's happened in Brexit, what's happening today in Brussels. If we get the narrative wrong about improving carbon on reducing emissions in livestock, we will lose the argument. And there are some potential other worrying things coming down the line. And so just to finish, 1 point on governance. So this is the FAO Food Price Index. It's been high recently, but I want to concentrate on what happened in 2008, 2010. We had a level of volatility we'd not seen since the oil price crisis, and we had loads of civil strife in the countries mentioned there. Recently, we've had a Ukraine shock that made major changes in gas and fertilizer prices. And I want to go back to a point that Philippe made about the huge amount of urbanization that we've had recently. These are all the cities with more than 500,000 people. And the brighter the colors, the faster they're growing. And look at all those urban centers growing in sub-Saharan Africa. And most of them are by the sea. And it's no coincidence they're by the sea because they still have to be fed from global commodity markets. The developing world imports net much more grain than it exports. And if you look at both climate shocks, disease shocks, the horrible things we've seen happening in Ukraine over the last few years, we need, I believe, to do the same exercise with the food system that we now do with the banking systems, to stress test the food system such that we know it is resilient. Now, the food system has been stressed by both the pandemic and the Ukraine war, and I think has come out quite well, but I would be much more reassured if we did some proper stress testing. Because if we get it wrong, if we get the food going to these big sub-Saharan African metropolises, we're going to see a mass migration of a type that we've never seen before. It's the right thing to get this thing right just ethically, but also it's the right thing to do just politically and almost selfishly to do it. So forgive me, I have gone over slightly, and I'll leave that up and not go through it.